In this installment, we're going to discuss how to add in explosions into the project. It came out of a discussion in class. So starting out with the file that I have now is a combination of the final duck hunt combined with the keyboard combined with the collisions. So this is taking the three kinds of things that we've worked with, modifying them a little bit. So the character got a little flashing light on top of his head and is now more of a robot. So thus we have robot fun. And we can see time lost. Now I can move, and if I score 2 of 1, so the game is now playable. But it's using what was in Duck Hunt. So looking at all of Duck Hunt. And then mashing that together with the keyboard code. And you can see they're highlighted from when I copied them and pasted them together. And then taking a small section out of collisions, which was trying to find out when one object is hitting another object, but then doing it for multiple objects that are appearing on screen. And with that, that brings us to this file, and we can work with that. So the enemy is going to be the object that appears. There will be a modification to that shortly, which will allow the enemy to explode. There is player, which is the little guy with the blinking light on his head. So if we click on that, you can see now it causes the blinking. And then it just has the buttons. I modified the blue button so it is using an actual button symbol wrapped in a movie clip wrapper, same as orange button, because that just simplifies things a little bit in the library. Still using the same screens of winner, loser, and start, just modified the text on the start screen. So that's the basics of what's going on with the artwork right now. And all of that combined with this basic code that you see here will be in the explosions 0 file. So after mashing them together, that leaves these import statements. For the keyboard movement, we need the left, right, up, and down. Player came out of keyboard. The screens and the buttons are coming out of Duck Hunt. The enemy array was formerly called Duck Array. Enemy array makes it a little more generic because this project is not going to feature ducks in it. And the timer's been slightly tweaked, so it's using a max time and a time left variable object as part of it. And then max time gets set, and then time left is equal to max time. The advantage of doing that is I can keep resetting how much time is left every time I replay the game. And if I want to change how long my timer is going to run, I can change this value here. This is the only time this number is specified. So when the timer is instantiated, it gets made with time left. So it makes sense to do that as part of the timer on it, is to tie it in that way so that I can play with it. But that, by not having the number hard-coded in the timer, it makes it a little bit easier or more flexible. Again, enemy array replaced duck array. So this file is just a mashup of the previous ones that we've looked at. So after setup runs, where it puts the startup screen and the orange button on screen, or I guess it's the blue button starts it, not the orange one. So the blue button is there. We click on blue, it gets rid of itself, gets rid of the start screen, calls load game. Load game is what then actually puts the game logic into memory. So that now makes sure that time gets reset, adds the player, the score, and the timer to the stage, puts the player in the middle. That's important, so during replay it doesn't start with the player where the game previously ended. Zeroes out the score, registers the keyboard events, and now we have the timer events that we need to start listening for. We update the message in the time field, we reset the timer, then we tell it to start, then we start loop, And this little tidbit here, stage.focus equals stage, the reason for that is after I click on my button, if I want to then have the keyboard start registering because the keyboard is attached to the stage, currently the stage doesn't have focus because when I clicked on the button, that button grabbed the focus of what the Swift is listening for events from. So by saying stage.focus equals stage, it makes the stage clickable again. Or I mean not clickable, it makes it so that it registers the keyboard input. So when I press the keys, the character starts moving. Otherwise I have to click on screen to make it go, oh yes, you did indeed want to register key down and key up. Now loop's been organized a little bit differently here. Moves the player, moves the enemies, creates new enemies. It checks for collisions, then checks to see if you've won, and then updates the text in the score field here. The move player is exactly straight out of the keyboard file, moving the player. So I'm going to condense that down in the interest of saving space, so I can just highlight, click there, and it now condenses it. I can hit this arrow to expand it or collapse it. That just means I don't have to scroll as far to get to things. Moving enemies is the same, except I modified how much it moves per frame. We could make it move in other directions if we so chose. Now checking for collisions, it's instead of checking for a single object like it did in the collisions file where it specified a specific objects as part of it. So red hit test object green. So instead of specifying that exactly, now at this point it is specifying it by looping through the array. So it loops through the enemies and then it checks to see if the player has hit that object in the array. If so, it gets rid of that object and pulls that object out of the array and adds to my score. Now you can see I've put a note to myself, add explosion here. That's where we will start adding in the logic of how to generate the explosion based on the discussion from Monday night's class. Spawning enemy is the same, except it's enemies instead of ducks. Check for win is the same. Timer stuff didn't change. So we can condense that down. Clean up. I decided it's tidier to get rid of the score and timer off of the screen as well as the player, so in case the player was off to the side, since the win and lose screens don't fully cover things, so that just makes it look a little bit nicer. It's a nice to have, not a must have. The click under orange still stayed the same, and the keyboard logic is the same as in the keyboard file as before, using the arrow keys to make things go. So there's a lot in here that is mostly the same. It's just mashing the different pieces together. What's going to happen next is to build the animation of the enemy exploding and then add in the logic of how to get that to appear on screen, but then also to have it remove itself from screen once that animation is done playing. Adding in the explosion for the enemy requires, as a first step, to take the enemy symbol and to duplicate that. And now this one I will call enemy explosion. And now that I have that, forgot to click on export for action script, so check that box, otherwise I could have typed it in over here. Double click, now it pulls it up. So what I want to do is I'm going to make it so that this explodes. So the first thing that I'm going to do is go ahead and choose my red color and add a new frame, F7, so we can see the previous one, and now I'm going to just paint in a little bit of explosion, and then just keep hitting. F7 and moving. I'm just moving the parts out. And because it will happen fairly quick, don't have to be really precise with this. It's part of explosion. Now if we turn off onion skinning, we can scrub it so we can see it goes out. Now this is going to be the first step of it. I have some ideas about how I might go back and modify this a little bit to give it a little different kind of explosion as part of it. But that's a nice start. Going back to my main scene, going into the code here. Go back where it says add explosion here. This is where I can add in that explosion. This is going to be a new variable I create here, so it's similar to creating the ducks, where I created, or the enemies, as we call them here. So now it creates the enemy explosion, and then we can add it. To the stage like that. Now, if I run this and run into it, we can see that it added explosion, and it put the explosion at the top of the screen. Now there's two of them because I hit 2, therefore I have a winner. If I start the game over, we can see that they're still there. So we're going to have some cleanup work and a few other things that will need to happen to organize this a little bit better, but we did prove it works. First off, it would be nice if the explosion happens where the player is. So to do that, we can set its X and Y. Equal to the item referred to. Now, if I notice this, if I were to try and run it like this, I'm going to run into a problem is that I removed that object from the array already. So what I probably want to do is before I get rid of the enemy object, we're going to add the explosion. And I can copy paste this and do the same thing with the Y's. So this adds the explosion at the same X and Y as where the enemy is, and then it removes the enemy from the screen. So if we run this now, and now the only hitch is that it's still running. So been able to locate it to where the enemy was, but now we need to have this object, this explosion, listen for being done. And with that we can add an event listener, and it's enter frame, and I'll call this explode loop. Now that function, we'll define that out. So to define out explode loop here, what I need to do is, it's going to be the same kind of way as I can listen for enemies the way that I had under move enemies. So it's going to be similar as using kind of, I guess move enemies isn't doing it, but it was under the previous duck click that we had over here. So under the duck click, where we're using this e.target. That's really what I'm going to be able to do to listen for it. So at this point we can say if e.target dot, and now it doesn't really know how to code hint here because it doesn't really know that e.target is going to be a movie clip that I'm referring to. Otherwise, the code hinting, if I identified it as a movie clip, it would be able to tell it. So I can say if the target's current frame is equal to the target's total frames, so that tells me has the animation finished playing. And if so, at this point, we can then say e.target dot parent dot remove child e.target. But before I do that, I'm also going to want to tell that object to quit listening, so I can also put in my event listener here. So we're going to, instead of adding an event listener, we can remove it. So e.target remove event listener, then remove it from the stage. So this now tells this particular explosion to quit listening for enter frames and then removes it from the stage. So that effectively will clean up the explosion. And it appears to work. So the next thing that I want to do is inside the explosion, so it doesn't disappear quite so quickly, I'm going to extend this out here, and then insert a keyframe with it like this, and I'm going to just take and fill this with a brighter color. So we're going to cause it to strobe a little bit. And what I want to do is I'm going to extend some of these frames out and work with it. So if I do this and option drag that chunk, now it copies it. Pull this down. Option drag it again. So I'm effectively creating a little strobing animation, get rid of the ending frames. So it almost, when it gets hit, it seems to strobe or flash like a little bomb. Now what would be nice is to have the explosion, if you notice, the explosion appeared on top of the player. So what I want to do is, after enemy has spawned, that point, we can just re-specify add child player. And just like we did with the crosshairs, this now keeps the player on top, so no matter where they are, the explosions seem to be occurring underneath them. And now it makes sense to probably extend the game out. So right now, I'm having to hunt through here to find out how many I'm checking for when. Instead of 2, I'm going to modify this to max score. Because once I start having values inside functions and I get lots of functions, it's easier to have my values as variables. And same way that score is going to start with 0. We can, with max times, then I'll just right here go max score equals 5. So now watching this, it should give me, the trick here is, will 5 appear before, and now my time is too quick, so maybe 10 seconds isn't long enough to play this, but it's more fun being able to see more. But I can modify my max time to say 30 and run it. So we can now see it's counting down from 30, and having them flash gives me a little nicer display, so they seem, it's almost like I'm setting a bomb off as part of it. So max score 5, maybe max score now of 10. So now robot fun, can move around for 30 seconds, and I can work on setting off these trying to score, and one more, and I will have 1. So, good luck, have fun, and keep working on those games.